Hey, if you're new here, this is The Last Climb. Today, I'm exploring how 3 rich kids showed up to Everest flexing expensive gear they didn't know how to use and kept acting like experience was something you could buy. That attitude would eventually leave their Sherpas facing an impossible choice no guide should ever have to make. It was April 28th, 2022. Mount Everest, the highest point on Earth, at 29,032 feet, straddles the border of Nepal and Tibet. On the Nepal side, the South Col route passes through the Khumbu Icefall, 4 high camps, and the death zone above 26,000 feet. In late April, most teams were still waiting for the more reliable mid-May summit window. This team chose to go anyway. These 3 young Americans believed they were ready. Carter Alcott was 24 years old, from Greenwich, Connecticut. His family had built significant wealth in private equity, and Carter grew up with the confidence that came with it. He had completed just 2 guided climbs before Everest, Kilimanjaro and a winter ascent in Colorado, but considered that enough preparation. He organized the expedition himself, negotiated directly with a commercial operator, and paid for the trip. Phineas Green, also 24, was from Charleston, South Carolina. He had joined Carter on both previous climbs and rarely questioned his decisions. Quiet and easygoing, he tended to keep concerns to himself. He had struggled more than the others during their Colorado climb and had a history of mild respiratory issues, but never disclosed either to the expedition operator. Anderson Brooks, 23, was from Newport Beach, California. Athletic and highly competitive, he had trained harder than the others before the trip, spending months running, lifting, and preparing at altitude. He joined partly because Carter invited him, and partly because he had no interest in being left behind. While Carter naturally took charge, Anderson constantly pushed to prove himself. In different ways, both men approached Everest as something to conquer. All 3 had been close since prep school. The dynamic between them was the kind that forms early and sticks. Carter led, Phineas followed, and Anderson competed with Carter while remaining his friend. On a mountain, though, who leads and who follows can matter a great deal. Sometimes good judgment matters more than strength. Everest's South Col route passes through the death zone, everything above 26,000 feet, where the air contains roughly 1/3 of the oxygen available at sea level. The human body cannot acclimatize to these conditions. It can only endure them for a limited time before organ systems begin to fail. The longer a climber stays there, the greater the risk, and the effects often impair the judgment needed to recognize the danger. The Khumbu Icefall, the first major obstacle above base camp, is a moving glacier riddled with deep crevasses and unstable ice towers called seracs. It is navigated via aluminum ladders laid horizontally across gaps and fixed ropes running through the most dangerous sections. It requires crampons, precise footwork, and the ability to move efficiently at altitude with a loaded pack. Entire sections can collapse without warning as the glacier shifts beneath them. April on Everest is still early in the climbing season. The jet stream often remains over the summit, keeping winds in the death zone dangerously high. Most teams wait until the more reliable summit window that usually opens in mid to late May. Above Camp 4, there is no shelter, and weather can deteriorate faster than climbers can descend. The 3 men arrived in Kathmandu in late March, with matching custom expedition suits, deep navy with their initials embroidered on the chest. An outerwear brand had provided them as part of a planned content partnership. The suits were expensive and visually impressive, but because they were custom prototypes, the expedition operator questioned whether they had been adequately tested for Everest's extreme conditions. Carter said they had reviewed the specifications and were comfortable with the gear. The concern was noted, and the suits went on the mountain. Seriously, what is it with rich people assuming that they know better than the people that they've hired? It drives me nuts. Yes, in most parts of their lives, that's usually true. Just wasn't true up there. They also paid to have a portable hyperbaric chamber added to the expedition's medical equipment at base camp. It was an expensive extra precaution, though none of the 3 men ever asked how it worked. It would never leave base camp, making it irrelevant once the summit push began. Their lead Sherpa met them in Lukla. He had summited Everest 8 times and guided commercial clients on the South Col route for more than a decade. Within days, he had formed an impression of the group. Carter tended to make decisions quickly, sometimes before all the information was available. Anderson pushed the pace on climbs harder than necessary. Phineas was quieter and more cautious, though the Sherpa gradually realized he was simply working harder than he wanted others to notice. The trek from Lukla to base camp takes approximately 9 days and gains nearly 10,000 feet of elevation. It is not technically demanding, but it is the first real test of how a body responds to altitude, and it is where the Sherpa team begins forming their understanding of the clients they are going to take up the mountain. The first disagreement came at Namche Bazaar, where the standard itinerary included a rest day for acclimatization. Carter asked whether it was truly necessary. The lead Sherpa explained that acclimatization happened during rest, not movement, and that shortcuts taken lower on the mountain increased risk higher up. Carter accepted the answer, but later suggested to Anderson and Phineas that the Sherpas tended to default to maximum caution regardless of the client. At base camp, the three men spent much of their first afternoon filming content. They had even paid to have a compact espresso machine carried up from Lukla, which drew curious looks from nearby teams. Carter noticed the attention and commented on the older, mismatched gear used by one neighboring expedition. Anderson glanced over and joked that their boots probably cost less than the camera equipment his group had brought.
Man, some people really can't resist comparing price tags. I don't know, maybe save the gear snobbery until after you've actually climbed the mountain.
Now, before the climb, the lead Sherpa reviewed the acclimatization schedule, oxygen use, emergency procedures, and the summit day turnaround time. 2 in the afternoon at the latest, regardless of how close anyone was to the top. Anderson asked whether that was a fixed rule or something that could be adjusted based on conditions. The Sherpa said it was non-negotiable. Too many climbers had died after staying high on the mountain too long. Anderson said he understood. The first acclimatization rotation took them through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1. Carter moved steadily. Anderson moved quickly, often closing safety gaps that were intentionally left between climbers. Phineas was noticeably slower, and his breathing drew the Sherpa's attention. The second rotation took them to Camp 2, and partway up the Lhotse face, Carter handled the altitude reasonably well. Anderson pushed hard and began fading above 22,000 feet, which he blamed on a poor night's sleep. Phineas developed a persistent headache and lost much of his appetite, but told neither of his friends. The Sherpa advised Phineas to descend for an extra rest day. Phineas insisted the headache was improving, and Carter agreed that he knew his own body best. The Sherpa warned that symptoms at that altitude should not be ignored, but left the decision to him. Phineas stayed. When the headache faded the next day, he took it as proof there had never been a problem.
A headache fading at altitude doesn't necessarily mean the problem went away, because sometimes it just means the body found a temporary way to cope. And that, my friend, was exactly what was happening to Phineas.
During the second rotation, a weather system moved in faster than forecast, and the lead Sherpa called a rest day at Camp 2. Conditions above were not safe for upward progress. Carter and Anderson were frustrated. From their tent, the weather did not look nearly as bad as the decision suggested, and every delay reduced the already narrow margin available later in the season. That afternoon, Anderson set up a camera. The three men recorded a video about the delay. The tone was calm and measured. Carter suggested that some of the caution built into commercial expeditions was aimed more at average clients than climbers who had prepared thoroughly. He emphasized that while Sherpas provided invaluable expertise, climbers still had to make their own decisions. Anderson agreed, saying there was a difference between respecting experience and handing over your judgment entirely. They believed they understood the risks and were capable of assessing conditions for themselves.
I'm all for thinking by yourself, but if I've climbed Everest 0 times and the other guy has done it 8, I'm all ears.
After completing their acclimatization rotations, the three men returned to base camp for 4 days of rest. During the final summit briefing, the lead Sherpa reviewed the plan one last time: oxygen management, turnaround times, warning signs of altitude illness, and what to do if someone became unable to descend under their own power. He also emphasized the weather. A storm system was forecast to arrive within 30 to 36 hours of their planned departure from Camp 4, leaving little room for delays. Climbers who stayed too high on the mountain for too long would risk being caught by deteriorating conditions. He specifically reminded Phineas not to ignore any symptoms after the headache he had experienced during acclimatization. Phineas said he felt fine. Over the next 2 days, they climbed to Camp 4 on the South Col at 26,000 feet. Camp 4 sits inside the death zone, where the human body can no longer properly recover. Exposed to wind and extreme cold, it is a place where climbers rest only long enough to prepare for the summit push. During the climb to Camp 4, Carter developed a dry cough. By the time they reached camp, it was noticeable enough that Anderson asked about it. Carter blamed the cold, dry air and brushed it off. Later that evening, while trying to sleep before the summit attempt, he found it difficult to lie completely flat. He felt a mild pressure in his chest and a sensation that he could not quite draw a full breath. He assumed it was the altitude, adjusted his position, and eventually fell asleep. He did not mention it to anyone.
Not gonna lie, if I were sitting at Camp 4 coughing my lungs out, I'd probably blame the cold air too. Unfortunately, the mountain doesn't always make it easy to tell the difference between discomfort and danger.
They left Camp 4 at 10:15 that night. Conditions were acceptable for a summit attempt: cold, dark, and windy, but within the range the team had expected. The lead Sherpa went first, followed by Carter. Anderson stayed close behind him, while Phineas remained near the back of the group with another Sherpa. The climb started smoothly. Carter set a steady pace and moved well through the lower section despite his persistent cough. Anderson matched him step for step. Phineas was slower from the beginning, though not enough to cause immediate concern. The group reached the balcony at roughly 27,700 feet after 5 hours and 40 minutes. It was longer than planned. Much of the delay came from Phineas, whose movements had become increasingly deliberate on the steeper terrain. He was still climbing, but he seemed to be working harder for every step. To keep the group together, the lead Sherpa reduced the pace, cutting into their time margin. By then, Carter's cough had changed. Earlier, it had been dry and occasional. Now it sounded wetter and required more effort to clear. He continued climbing at a reasonable pace, but the Sherpa behind him noticed the difference. "I'm not saying I'd be worried yet, but I definitely wouldn't be feeling great about things." At the balcony, the team stopped to check oxygen supplies. Carter was close to projections. Anderson had used slightly more oxygen than expected after pushing the pace earlier in the climb. Phineas had used the most. His body was working harder than the others, and the slower ascent had consumed valuable time and oxygen. Flow rates were adjusted, but they were already behind where they wanted to be on both time and oxygen, and the most demanding part of the climb still lay ahead. The climb from the balcony to the south summit took another 5 hours and 20 minutes. By that point, all three men had spent hours in the death zone, where every step requires effort and judgment gradually begins to erode. Phineas was struggling the most. His pace had slowed noticeably, and his movements were becoming less precise. He followed instructions from the Sherpa, but his responses were delayed, and his focus seemed dulled. The second Sherpa stayed close enough to grab him if necessary.
I think a lot of people imagine altitude sickness as something dramatic, Most of the time, it looks a lot more like this.
Carter's condition was also deteriorating. His cough had become wet and persistent, forcing him to stop every few dozen steps to recover. He was still climbing competently, but the effort required was increasing. The lead Sherpa listened to his breathing and grew concerned. It sounded different from normal altitude fatigue. Anderson remained the strongest climber of the group. He was moving efficiently and managing his oxygen better than the others, but his focus had narrowed almost entirely to reaching the summit. As long as he was still moving well, everything else seemed secondary.
That's the tricky part. You can be climbing well and still miss things that matter. Being strong doesn't automatically mean you're seeing the whole picture.
The group reached the south summit at 10:40 that morning. There, the lead Sherpa stopped them and recommended turning around. The summit was less than an hour away, but conditions had changed. A weather system approaching from the west was moving faster than forecast. Phineas was showing clear signs of altitude-related impairment. Carter's breathing had worsened steadily throughout the climb. Their oxygen margins were tighter than planned, and the delays earlier in the ascent had consumed much of the safety buffer they started with. Carter refused. They had spent weeks on the mountain, and he was unwilling to turn back so close to the summit. Anderson agreed, arguing that the weather might hold and that they had come too far to stop now. Phineas, exhausted and struggling, quietly said he could continue. The lead Sherpa made it clear that he strongly advised against going higher. Then he continued with them. Leaving 3 clients alone at the south summit was not an option he was willing to consider.
This is one of the reasons I admire Sherpas so much. They often risk their own lives trying to protect people from their mistakes.
They reached the summit at 11:25 in the morning. All three of them stood at 29,032 feet above sea level. The wind had picked up noticeably in the last 40 minutes of the ascent. The sky to the west had continued to change the color and texture of it. The way the light was moving were things the lead Sherpa had seen before and knew the name of. They had been above Camp 4 for, by that point, nobody was at their sharpest anymore. The descent began at 11:43 in the morning. Within 20 minutes of leaving the summit, the wind had strengthened to the point where forward movement required active bracing against it. The system from the west was arriving ahead of the revised forecast. Visibility was beginning to close from the west side of the ridge. The temperature had dropped sharply and continued dropping. Carter's condition worsened steadily on the descent. Between the summit and the south summit, he stopped repeatedly as coughing fits became longer and harder to recover from. The sound coming from his chest had changed. It was no longer the dry cough he had dismissed at Camp 4. Now there was a wet, gurgling quality to his breathing that the lead Sherpa could hear even through the wind. The problem had likely begun the night before. Fluid was accumulating in Carter's lungs, making it harder for his body to absorb oxygen. As the hours in the death zone added up, the condition worsened. He was still moving and still clipped to the fixed rope, but every section of the descent required more effort than the one before.
The body can put up a pretty good fight for a while. Eventually, though, it runs out of ways to compensate.
At approximately 28,400 feet, Carter sat down on the ridge. He did not fall. He simply stopped, leaned against a fixed rope anchor, and said he needed a minute. The lead Sherpa checked his oxygen and switched him to an emergency bottle, but it made little difference. The gurgling in his breathing had become more pronounced. When the Sherpa tried to help him stand, Carter could not get back on his feet. He remained conscious, but his body was no longer responding the way it needed to. A short distance behind them, Phineas was also failing. His decline had looked very different from Carter's. The headache he experienced during acclimatization had never completely gone away. Throughout the summit push, he had continued climbing while gradually becoming slower and less coordinated. The delayed footwork the Sherpas noticed on the ascent was no longer subtle. By the descent, the second Sherpa had begun physically guiding him through difficult sections because he was struggling to place his feet correctly. At approximately 28,500 feet, Phineas sat down and could not get back up. He was conscious, but his responses had become slow and disconnected. His eyes were open, yet he seemed unable to fully process instructions. Like Carter, he could no longer coordinate his body well enough to continue descending safely. Anderson was ahead of both of them. He had been moving faster than the rest of the group for much of the descent and was roughly 180 feet farther down the ridge when the radio call came through about Carter. The third Sherpa faced an impossible choice. Anderson was still moving, still attached to the fixed rope, and still heading toward Camp 4. Carter could no longer stand, and Phineas was beginning to fail as well. The Sherpa told Anderson to stay on the rope and keep descending toward Camp 4. Then he turned around and climbed back up the ridge to help the others. Anderson continued alone.
I try not to judge Anderson too harshly here. Remember, folks, the version of Anderson making this decision wasn't the well-rested 23-year-old who left base camp.
At approximately 1:20 that afternoon, the storm reached the ridge in full force. The wind went from strong to violent within minutes. Visibility dropped to near zero. With wind chill, temperatures at that elevation were approaching negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The fixed rope was still there, but finding it and staying clipped to it in a whiteout required coordination that the cold, altitude, and long hours in the death zone had steadily eroded. Anderson's judgment had been deteriorating for hours. Not dramatically, and not in a way he would have noticed, but enough to affect the decisions he was making. The focus that had driven him up the mountain had narrowed his attention to a single goal: keep moving down. He was paying less attention to the weather, his oxygen, and his own condition.
He had spent the entire expedition trying to prove he was the strongest one up there. On that ridge, alone in a whiteout, none of that meant anything anymore.
Radio contact with Camp 4 was established at approximately 1:35 in the afternoon. A rescue from below was not possible. No one could ascend into those conditions. The team at base camp could only maintain contact and wait. The lead Sherpa remained with Carter on the ridge, administering the last of the emergency oxygen and attempting to keep him responsive. Carter was conscious for a period, and then he was not. The lead Sherpa stayed with him until the conditions made remaining on the ridge no longer survivable. The second Sherpa remained with Phineas in the same way, for the same duration, with the same outcome. Anderson's last confirmed position, based on the GPS device recovered later, was logged at approximately 28,100 feet at 2:07 in the afternoon, further along the descent ridge than Carter or Phineas, moving in the direction of Camp 4, alone in the whiteout. The lead Sherpa reached Camp 4 in the early hours of April 29th, severely depleted, with frostbite to 2 fingers on his right hand. The second Sherpa arrived approximately 90 minutes later. The third arrived 40 minutes after that. None of them had been able to bring anyone down. Radio contact with Camp 4 was maintained throughout the storm. By early afternoon on April 28th, the team at base camp understood the situation, but there was little they could do. No rescue team could safely climb into those conditions, and the resources at Camp 4 were limited to what had already been carried up the mountain. 2 days after the storm passed, a search team ascended from Camp 4. Carter Alcott was found at approximately 28,400 feet, still seated against the fixed rope anchor where he had stopped. Phineas Green was found about 100 feet farther down the ridge in a similar position. Anderson Brooks was not on the route. The search continued for 3 more days before incoming weather forced it to end. Anderson was never found. His last confirmed GPS position was recorded at 2:07 p.m. on April 28th, placing him on the descent ridge, alone and moving toward Camp 4 in near-zero visibility. The expedition operator's report reconstructed the climb through GPS data, radio logs, oxygen records, and footage recovered from the climber's cameras. The timeline showed the slower-than-planned ascent, the oxygen consumed above schedule, the recommendation to turn around at the south summit, and the decision to continue despite worsening conditions. Images taken near the south summit also supported the Sherpa's account that the weather system arrived sooner than forecast. The report further noted that the portable hyperbaric chamber the group had paid to add to the expedition remained at base camp unused. Even if it had been available higher on the mountain, it would not have changed the outcome at those elevations. The official findings concluded that Carter died from high-altitude pulmonary edema, or HAPE, a condition in which fluid accumulates in the lungs and gradually prevents the body from absorbing enough oxygen. Phineas died from high-altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, a severe swelling of the brain caused by oxygen deprivation at extreme altitude. Both reports cited prolonged time in the death zone and the decision to continue beyond the recommended turnaround point as contributing factors. Anderson Brooks was listed as presumed dead. Investigators concluded that he likely became separated from the route during the whiteout storm while low on oxygen and already impaired by the effects of extreme altitude. The operator's final statement noted that the recommendation to turn around at the south summit had been based on the weather, the group's oxygen situation, and the visible deterioration of 2 climbers. All 3 chose to continue. The Sherpas continued with them because that was their responsibility. 2 remained with their clients on the descent ridge until conditions made it impossible to do more.
Honestly, this whole story feels avoidable. Maybe with a little more humility and a little more patience, things would have ended differently. But what do I know? If you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button and go ahead and subscribe. Yeah, I'm talking to you. Come on, we're coming out with videos. Help us out, we'll help you out. New video each week. We'll see you soon.